Welcome, everyone. My name is Brene Lloyd, and I work with Northwatch. And this is the third session in our 13th annual webinar series, Nuclear Waste Online. I'm joining you from Northeastern Ontario, from Nipissing Territory and Robinson Huron Treaty Area. Northwatch's area of membership and primary concern is Anishinaabe Aski Nation Territory Treaty 3, where the NWMO is investigating for a nuclear waste burial site. And within our region, also Robinson Huron and Robinson Superior Treaty areas, and unceded Algonquin territory in the Temiskaming-Outaouais watershed. So I'm very pleased to have with us 4 panelists for our international session, and you'll be hearing from each of them today. 5 panelists, because Chuka is being joined with by Tom. So we're going to begin with just a very brief Canadian context. There are earlier sessions in this series that you can go to for more detail. And then we're going to hear from Johan, status in Sweden and Finland, from Chuka and Tom about status of DGR, Deep Geological Repository pursuit in France, from Richard, the situation in the United Kingdom, and from Tim Judson, about the United States situation. Then we'll go on to question and answer discussion and talk about the remaining sessions still to come. So briefly, Canadian context is the nuclear industry has been generating waste for decades, and they've generated 60,000 tons, over 3 million bundles of nuclear fuel waste to date, and that's expected to double. Since the 1970s, they've been pursuing variations on the plan to bury the high-level waste that they've created. They now, since 2005, have been pursuing something they call adaptive phased management. And that begins with extracting the waste from the dry storage containers at the site, transportation to their central site, then processing, and then burial, and then abandonment. So the Nuclear Waste Management Organization wants to bury and abandon all of the waste in a single location. And since 2010, they've studied locations associated with 22 different municipalities. In 2020, they shortlisted to 2 potential sites. And on November 28th, 2024, they announced that they selected the Rebel site in Northwestern Ontario as their preferred location. You can see on your screen, the Rebel site is the black target in the fairly center to the screen, and the other icons indicate the current location of the radioactive waste. So they announced the selection in November 2024. Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation is the closest First Nation, and the one that NWMO has designated as one of 2 host communities, along with the township of Ignace, 45 kilometers distant and in a different watershed. Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation said that they acknowledge the site selection, but they'll be carrying out their own process. It will be subject to their own determination through their own regulatory assessment and approval process. Eagle Lake First Nation is the next most adjacent community. And this community, this territory, is Treaty 3 territory. There are 28 different First Nations. There has been a unanimous resolution passed in October by Treaty 3 chiefs expressing strong opposition to the NWMO incursion into their territory. Eagle Lake First Nation in December announced a legal challenge of the NWMO selection of the Rebel site. And it's on the basis of that being their shared territory, and they should have been part of the decision-making and given the option of both accepting or rejecting the site. NWMO says they'll carry on. In 2024, they selected the site. They expect to initiate their approvals process, which will be lengthy. In 2025, they predict that they'll go to the impact assessment hearing and first licensing hearing in 2028. And they'll be up and running in the 2040s. That's their view. We, the Nuclear Free North, is the alliance of groups across Northern Ontario. And key messages from We, the Nuclear Free North is there is no willing host. We're all at risk, reactor communities, transportation communities, and communities down in the area and downstream. NWMO uses bait and switch. They changed their selection criteria, and they have a free hand. There are no rules, poor regulation, and no government oversight. And it's not over. Criticism and opposition must and will continue. So that is the Canadian situation, and we're very pleased to have our international colleagues with us today to provide updates from other countries dealing with the same kind of challenge by the nuclear industry there. And with that, I'll pass it on over to Johan Swan. Johan was the director with MKG for many years, which was a coalition of NGOs in Sweden concerned and critical of SKB's nuclear waste repository proposal. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Johan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So my name is Johan Swan, and I am sitting in Göteborg on the west coast of Sweden. As Brennan said, I have been working for MKG for many years, from 2005 until 2023. And MKG had an office with 2 personnel, and it was funded by the Swedish government during this time. And the government that came in the autumn of 2022 decided to shut down that funding. So now MKG still exists, and the website exists, and there's a board working on a voluntary basis. And I am now working as a senior advisor to the board, and therefore also following these issues. So I will share a presentation. Where is the presentation? Let me make sure I see it. Give me a second. There we go. Now it should be possible to see it. I will have to stop sharing and start over again. So I go back to the meeting, I start sharing, and there is the presentation. There we are. So the idea here is for me to give an update of what is happening in Sweden and Finland, because Sweden and Finland both have quite advanced programs for the disposal of spent nuclear fuel, and are also relevant for the Canadian case in that they are using granite and also the copper canister, and I will return to that. So very quickly, this is the south of Sweden, and you have the map on the right here where you have the south of Sweden with Stockholm, Göteborg, where I am, and Malmö, Copenhagen in Denmark. And here's Finland. And here up on the coast here is Forsmark, a nuclear power plant north of Stockholm. And it's also where the repository for spent fuel is planned. And on the Finnish side, just across the Gulf of Bothnia, is Turku here, and up here is the Olkiluoto site, where there is a nuclear power plant, where there is the program to build, or where it's being built, the repository for spent fuel in Finland, the Olkiluoto site there. Sweden has for a long time been operating nuclear power plants. We've had 12 to start with, we have 6 now. And there's a central storage facility at Oskarshamn nuclear power plant on the southeast coast of Sweden, where all the spent fuel is in one place. And here there is to build an encapsulation plant to put the fuel in copper canisters and then transport it up to Forsmark, where the repository is to be built about 500 meters down into the ground. And I think you all know about the KBS method. It's from started to be developed in the mid-70s. In 1883, the system that is now planned was finalized. And it relies, of course, on the copper canister, a 5-centimeter copper canister with the clay around it. And then down in the tunnels are to be filled also with clay. There's been a long selection process to find a site, very complicated. But in 2009, the waste company SKB chose Forsmark. And in total, about 11,500 tons of spent fuel in 6,000 canisters supposed to be deposited. This can be compared to what Brennan said about 60,000, I think, tons in Canada approximately. So there are a number of important decisions and developments. SKB developed and cited the KBS method from mid-70s to 2011. They then handed in a licensing application that was reviewed by two different legislations, the Environmental Code, where the Environmental Court had the review, and then the Nuclear Activities Act, where the regulator SSM is responsible. And by January 2018, this review had been ongoing for a long time. And that time, the court recommended to the government to say no due to problems with the copper canister. And then there was a review by the government until January 2022. And the government actually decided then to allow the building of the repository in Forsmark and the encapsulation plant in Oskarshamn. And they relied almost exclusively on the regulatory statements that there was a holistic multi-barrier system. So if there was a copper problem, it might not be as bad as some, especially some researchers at the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm had been saying, where they had been saying it could break down after a couple of 100 years, the first canisters and so on. My organization, MKG, together with the Swedish Society for Conservation and others, we appealed this, but the court approved the decision. And this is important because it's quite complicated to understand what is going on in Sweden, what is happening regarding who has approved what and so on. But there was a continued license review between 2023 and 2024 by the Environmental Court, and they then decided to give a license to start building the non-nuclear facilities, basically. They also, of course, approved the repository itself and so on, but those things are nuclear, and they are covered by they also have to be permitted by the regulator. So you may have seen news now that they have started to build the repository in Sweden, but basically they have just started to put a shovel in the ground, and they can cut down trees, and they can build perhaps a few facilities overground. But what is going on at the moment is that SKB has handed just recently in a new safety case to be approved by the regulator SSM, and they need to get the permission to start to build a repository underground. And this may come in a couple of years approximately. It'll take 8 to 10 years to build. So we are looking at the start of operation perhaps in the middle of the next decade in Sweden. And many things can happen until then, of course. However, in Finland, let's see did I miss something? There. Finland, however, is actually going faster than Sweden, and they're using the same method. They were reprocessing earlier, but then after the Cold War ended, they could not send the spent fuel to Russia for reprocessing. So they decided to use the Swedish KBS method. And they have been seeing it as very much a technical project. The Swedes see the project as being an environmental project, I would say. And already it was decided by the government to approve the repository in principle, and it should be ready by the early 2020s. And this has been happening. So the construction of the repository at the Olkiluoto nuclear power plant, it's called Onkalo, they call this the cave, sort of, it's called the repository. It has been completed, and the encapsulation plant is completed. And the company then, in the company Posiva, they submitted in December 2021 an application for operations. I mean, operations means to put canisters into the ground with spent fuel in it. And the regulator Stuk has been quite slow in the review process. But Posiva hopes by the end of the year by the end of this year to get the permit by Stuk. This is about 10 years then before Sweden, and the government actually needs to take a decision. But that is almost going to be that's not going to be a showstopper. Just a few to finalize this. Why is POSIBA having problems? I was at a meeting in Hanover and for a EU research project in the autumn, and I had the chance to talk to some POSIBA people, and it was quite clear that they did not really have all the machinery for underground operation and so on available yet. And it's possible that the Stuk, the regulator, is actually looking at can actually POSIBA do what they have said that they will do. So it's probably not a question of like the safety cases of like copper that is slowing things down, but more practical things. The MKG website is still operating. I am sometimes putting in new information also on the English side, not very often, but it's historically there is an English section where you can read quite a lot about what's been going on for the last 20 years. I can also recommend this book. It's open access, which means that you can free of charge download the book and the chapters. And I've written a book about the Swedish situation in this book, a chapter in this book. That may be worthwhile reading. And also, of course, this covers other EU countries as well. So that was my presentation. And I give the word back. I will just stop the sharing. There we go.
Thanks very much, Johan. That was very, very helpful. We're going to move now to Chuka and Tom, who are activists, French activists associated with a number of groups and efforts to stop CIGEO's planned nuclear waste burial scheme in Bourg in northeast France. And Chuka's joined by Tom. They're speaking from the House of Resistance in Bourg, and they're both activists organizing against CIGEO's proposed DGO. So, Chuka, over to you.
Thanks. Okay, so first thing is that, as you know, France is a very much nuclearized territory. We have like 57 nuclear plants that have been built since the years 50s and 60s. So we need the DGO for that, for all the waste that has been created because of creation of electricity, but also nuclear bombs, because we need a lot of those. But also, the idea is that because France has been selling the French model, they've been selling the French way of doing nuclear construction, they need to have the model to be complete. So they would very much like to be able to sell the model with CIGEO, which is the how they call the DGR here. So that's one of the reasons why they pushing as much as they can to build CIGEO here in Meuse. So the CIGEO project started in the year in the 90s, and at first they were legally obliged to test at least 3 different types of soil. So they were supposed to try clay and granite and other types of material. But they came upon so much resistance that the only place where they managed to put their feet in the door and to start up their project was here in Bourg, which is one of the least populated areas of France, also one of the poorest. So now they claim that if they're here, it's because the soil is made of clay, and that would be the only good material. But actually, if you look at the history, they also said there's no declaration from officials that say, well, just put enough people in the street of news to keep us from doing it, and we'll see. So they're supposed to start building again in 2020, but here we are in 2023, they didn't really start it because they keep getting technical difficulties. What they did build is a small prototype. So, which already takes a lot of place. Like, if you're coming around here and you see that it's mostly farms and big agricultural landscapes, and also some forests and very, very small villages. And what you have in the middle is the beginning of CG, which looks like a huge airport, actually. And in there, the only thing that you find is a small prototype, so gallery where they started doing tests. But building this prototype has already caused 2 deaths amongst the workers. So, to give you an idea of how much they're infected with everything. And what you also can find at this place, sorry we didn't prepare any pictures, so I forgot, but it's also, they've got a kind of museum that you can visit, and also like a hostel, which is mostly used for mostly policemen that live there. And so the project is 500 kilometers of galleries, and it's supposed to last for 100 years. So 100 years to build it, but also what they're planning is at the same time that they're building it, they want to start bringing the nuclear waste inside. So it sounds pretty dangerous. And also, what we're expecting is a complete, well, it's already started, but it's only going to get bigger with the huge change of landscape that this means, and also of how this whole area functions socially. So they've been in a position since the very beginning, the mayors, farmers, but also people that came here because driven by their anti-nuclear commitment. So almost since the beginning, CJ started in 1990, and and the House of Resistance, which is where we are, was bought in 2004. So before that, there was like treatments outside of the CJ that they were starting to build. Not the CJ, but the site of it's Andra that is. It's the organization for nuclear waste here in France, called Andra. So, sorry, I get lost a little bit. So yeah, the House of Resistance was bought in 2004. It's a house that is in the village of Bure, which is a very, very small village. So you have this like big house in the middle that's been bought by opponents in 2004, and that's used for activists that come simply to stay. So soldiers that, if you come, you can visit Andra, and they'll tell you what they think they're doing, and then you can come to House of Resistance, and other people will tell you otherwise. So that's one of the big parts of the resistance. You also have people that have moved in here to start and cultivate a lot of like different collective. There's a whole life around Bure that is built around resistance to the nuclear industry. The idea of like, well, they're trying to destroy this area. They're trying to militarize it, to nuclearize it, to make it like a dead area. Well, some people come and bring like life here, and people want to live here, bring like bars and library activities and things like that. Getting attached to the place, basically. Um, and so another big part of resisting to CJO was in 2017. They started destroying a little bit. It's called Bois de Vue. So this year first they were starting to destroy. They didn't even have the authorization to do it, but they started destroying it, and so some opponents lived in the woods, and they built, ZAD. I guess you've heard of some from ZAD. So a village that lasted for a year. People living in the woods there. And it was evicted so the same year, in 2017. And since then, there's been like a big rise in repression. So, like lots of following anybody that would be in prominence, be it like activists or just like farmers that say they're against it, and also like huge lawsuits. Like the biggest one is 24,000 pages, and also it includes 500 hours of wiretapping of people who are struggling here. So yeah, since then repression has gone a little bit down, like there's been less confrontation, let's say, but it's still a very important part of the struggle here in Bure. When you come here, you know that like you're gonna be watched by police. They're gonna take your identity at some point, and so. They still don't have the legal authorization to build CJO. Like the project hasn't been validated yet, but a bit like what Joanne said before, they've got some authorization. Well, what they've got is the Declaration of Public Utility. So that gives them the right to build all the things around CJO. So that's like the train tracks, a gigantic transformer, and because they have this declaration of public utility, that means that they're starting to evict people. And so it's starting like this summer probably, or the upcoming years. It's not really clear how fast they're going to move, but clearly we're expecting a lot of changes in the landscape and in the upcoming years. Yeah, I guess we can talk more during the questions.
Thanks very much, Silke. That was a great update on what's actually happening in Bure. We're now going to move to our third presenter, Richard Outram. Richard is the secretary with the nuclear-free local authorities in the United Kingdom. And Richard, I'm going to check. I think you wanted me to share your slides.
Yes, please.
And I'm going to check. I'm going to ask you to start your camera, Richard.
Right, thanks. Okay, thanks, Brinaine. Thanks, Kathy. Good afternoon, good evening, everybody, wherever you are. Just to express solidarity greetings from the United Kingdom for the various struggles you're engaged in. I'm Richard Outram. I'm the Secretary of the Nuclear-Free Local Authorities in the United Kingdom and Ireland. I've been in post about 3.5 years now. But the Nuclear-Free Local Authorities were actually set up in 1981 following the declaration of Manchester, which was the world's first declared nuclear-free local authority. And subsequently, we were joined by a very wide range of authorities across the United Kingdom. Essentially, we still continue to campaign against nuclear power, against nuclear weapons, and in favour of renewables, disarmament, and peace. So I have the great privilege of, being the secretary of that organisation. I've titled this Trouble in the Mill, as we call it here in the northwest of England. I'm based in Manchester. Basically because we've seen in recent months, particularly, a growth of opposition to plans for a nuclear dump within England. And we are looking at England here because there are no current plans for Scotland or Wales. So, Brinain, if you could move the slide on, please. Thanks. So I'm sure colleagues are aware that there's been a number of attempts by the UK government over the years to impose a nuclear waste dump on communities in the UK, primarily focusing on the county of Cumbria in northwest England, where most high-level waste is actually held, as I'm sure you're aware, at the infamous Sellafield facility. In the latest iteration of the attempt to impose a nuclear waste dump, an organisation called the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority was charged with taking on the task, and it created a division called radioactive waste management, which has subsequently morphed into nuclear waste services, and that actually now leads the process. What we have now is what's called a consent-based procedure that's established using government guidelines, and there's various stages that we go through in the process of establishing what's deemed to be a suitable site. The initial stage for any potential site is for what's called an interested party to express an interest to nuclear waste services that their area be investigated as a potential location for what's called, the official title is Geological Disposal Facility, or GDF. Now, it's interesting that the interested party can be a local authority, like I represent, or alternately, it can even be an individual, and that individual may have no connection with the actual area that's been proposed. So it's a rather bizarre starting point. What then happens is an informal group called a working group is established to see whether it's got the potential to be moved forward. And then afterwards, that working group becomes more formalized and becomes what's called a community partnership. And for that to take place, for that to be formed, and for the process to really get going in any area, they have to have what's called a relevant principal local authority to be engaged. So that's a kind of higher level lower authority, local authority rather. In the UK, we've got 3 what are called search areas. So these are areas of the UK the nuclear waste services are currently investigating for suitability for a geological disposal facility. 2 of them are actually in the county of Cumbria in northwest England. They're called Mid Copeland and South Copeland. And then in addition, we've got one in Lincolnshire on the east coast of England called Thedlethorpe. And each of these has a community partnership. And attached to them is a relevant principal local authority. So in the case of Cumbria, the local authority is the same. It's Cumberland Council. And in Thedlethorpe, we've actually got 2 local authorities, Lincolnshire County Council and East Lindsey District Council. Because they've formed community partnerships, what happens is that the local community can then make applications to a fund called the Community Investment Fund, which at the moment releases up to £1 million per year to local community projects. But if we move on, if an area is taken forward into what's called stage 2, where boreholes are actually dug, that increases to £2.5 million per year. Next slide, please. So this is kind of, obviously you'll see these slides, so I don't need to go into detail, but essentially on the left is a kind of time chart of where we are. And really, we're in effect on the second stage down in yellow, the first point in yellow, really, towards the top of the chart. Although it seems a long time for the communities engaged in this process, obviously it is a very long-term process, site selection. It could take 15 years, maybe longer, to get to the point where we get to an eventual site. And this chart details the process. I won't go into a lot of detail because of time, but in effect, the intention is to look to select a site by the 2030s, to build the site in the 2040s, and to become operational from the 2050s, with the possibility that the site might operate for between 150 and 175 years. With high-level waste from Sellafield being transferred into the site from 2075. There are 6 key factors that they use in determining siting, but the real ones that Nuclear Waste Services always emphasise is there must be what's called a willing community, and there must be suitable geology. The intention is currently to create an onshore receiving facility about 1 kilometre square to receive regular shipments of high-level waste, probably brought by rail, although in the case of Thedlethorpe, possibly by sea, because there's no rail service in that area at the moment. And then the intention is to take that waste below ground through access ways into tunnels and then out under the seabed, which would either be the Irish Sea if it was the Cumbrian site that was selected, or the North Sea if it was the Lincolnshire site that was selected. Where we actually are now, in that second level yellow section, is we've now had what are called specific areas of focus identified within each of the 3 search areas that Nuclear Waste Services will now be carrying out further geological surveys in, and also carrying out determinations about land ownership. We've not got to the stage yet of carrying out intrusive borehole drilling. That would only take place in the second stage, where the intention would be to take forward 2 of the 3 locations forward. And that would probably begin from the 2030s, because there's various, around probably 2030, because there are ministerial requirements in terms of approvals for that to go ahead. Next slide, please. Okay, so if I just have a very brief look at each of the 3 sites, and I've actually bunched 2 of the sites together in West Cumbria. So we've got Mid Copeland and we've got South Copeland. So because there's been a long history of engagement and opposition to a number of iterations of plans in Cumbria, we've got several existing anti-nuclear groups that are well established. So, we've got Radiation Free Lakeland, we've got Lakes Against the Dump or LAND. Previously, there was a group called CORE, which was Cumbrians opposed to a radioactive environment. And actually, at the end of this slide deck, there's actually all of the listed groups and their websites for colleagues to look at if you're of interest. So nonetheless, despite the fact we've had opposition groups, it's still seen as an easier target by the nuclear industry in which to locate a nuclear waste dump. Obviously, it's convenient for them in the sense that Sellafield is in effect co-located, and there's a certain degree of nuclear dependency in the county, because historically the nuclear industry has given grants to community groups and organisations, and obviously a fair number of local people work at Sellafield or have historically worked at Sellafield. They were thwarted in the last attempt to bring a nuclear waste dump by Cumbria, what was then called the Cumbria County Council. But that body has now been abolished, and it's been replaced by 2 new local authorities. And one suspects that the reason for that is because the intention was to make the new local authority more sympathetic to the prospect of the locating a nuclear waste dump in the county. We have 2 groups, Milliman District and South Copeland Against Nuclear, that's been formed. There was quite a lot of controversy early in the process when Nuclear Waste Services determined to carry out intrusive offshore sonar surveying. essentially where they blasted the seabed. And that did generate quite a lot of opposition from wildlife conservation groups. The other thing that's quite interesting is there's been some kickback recently from local authorities, small local authorities in the area. Two of the councils in the area have actually registered opposition to the latest plans. One of them has withdrawn from the community partnership, and the South Copeland Community Partnership is now in suspension with no proceedings, no meetings being held because it's subject to external review. The other good thing that has happened, one of the positives from the fact that Nuclear Waste Services has recently declared areas of focus, is that it's actually kick-started a lot more opposition. And in fact, this picture in the bottom right is a recent event where we had a couple of protesters there, and there's moves at the moment to actually create a new campaign group and actually hold some local events to organise opposition to the plans, which is the first time that's really happened in several years. So that's quite positive from an opposition point of view. Next slide, please. If we look at Lincolnshire, which is on the other side, on the east side of the country, this is an area that has on the coast a couple of seaside resorts, which colleagues may have heard of. You may have even visited if you've been to the UK. One is Skegness and one is Mablethorpe, very old traditional seaside resorts. A few years ago, there was a shock revelation when the BBC actually did a broadcast where they announced that the local council had been in secret talks with Nuclear Waste Services for several years about the prospects of locating a nuclear waste dump, or GDF, at an old gas terminal site that had ceased to operate several years previously. And for a number of years, the focus was on that site. But recently, they've been displaced in effect from the site because there's been a number of other energy projects expressed an interest in locating there, such as carbon capture, such as gas storage, possibly hydrogen production plant. So recently, Nuclear Waste Services moved their centre of attention to it more inland, and what they've done is, if you see on this plan, there's a dark green spot. That's basically high-grade agricultural land that they've chosen now to look at as their area of focus, and that's really generated a lot of opposition to the plans. There is already considerable opposition in the area. This is not a traditional nuclear dependent area of the country. It's dependent on tourism, it's dependent on farming. In the most recent local elections that we had, virtually every candidate that was elected at all level of government was an anti-nuclear dump avowed candidate. All of the local councils pretty much have passed anti-dump resolutions. There's been surveys done by particularly one of the very, very active local councillors that's indicated about 85% of people are consistently opposed to these plans. And there's also been a survey done that indicates there could be a huge slump in tourism, because about 8 out of 10 tourists that were surveyed indicated they probably wouldn't come back to the area if such a facility was built. There's been such a lot of pressure put on local councils that they had to concede reluctantly to holding what's called a test of public support. And within the procedure, because it's meant to be based on a willing community, at some point in the process, there's meant to, prior to selection of a site, there's meant to be a test of public support. And it's actually up to the local authority to determine what the timing of that test is. So these two councils in this area responsible for input into the process, they agreed to hold a test of public support in 2027. Next slide, please. So in terms of that, I mentioned they'd moved the emphasis, the area of focus, this agricultural area. And what is interesting as a result of that is it started a whole new wave of opposition. People who were previously not at all engaged with this process or opposed to GDF have suddenly said, we don't want it near our village. And in the middle there at the top, there's actually a recent poll that was carried out by the village. The people outside this village hall with this banner are actually from that village. And actually about 90% of people basically asked for the plan to be immediately scrapped, or if not immediately scrapped, for a test of public support to be immediately held. In the bottom right there, at bottom left there, sorry, is the leader of one of the local councils. And he's just recently decided that he's going to recommend to his council, East Lindsey District Council, to withdraw from the process, which was a real sudden shock. But not perhaps that surprising, because that council and Lincolnshire Council have always expressed opposition to energy projects built on agricultural land, and it would be very hypocritical of them to actually continue to support a nuclear waste dump on high quality agricultural land when they're opposed to solar farms, when they're opposed to wind turbines, and when they're opposed to electricity pylons being erected on the same parcels of land. The other thing that's been going on is in the top right-hand corner is some indicative results carried out by a local councillor at each of the public events that Nuclear Waste Services have recently been holding, where there's been a very, very high number of people, percentage and number-wise, expressing very grave reservations about continuing with this process. We do have elections later this year in May, where there'll be an opportunity, again, for local people to express a view against the nuclear waste dump. And I wouldn't be surprised if the remaining council that remains in this process in Lincolnshire actually withdraws fairly soon, in which case that would kill the process stone dead, because there must be at least one major council in each area engaged in the process for it to continue. And in fact, this isn't the first time that's happened. Last year, there was a plan to introduce the potential of a nuclear waste dump in South Yorkshire, which again is on the east coast of England, but further north from this situation. And that actually plan only lasted 1 month before local people managed to persuade their local council to withdraw from the process, and that ended it. So there has already been a victory. There has been a victory through public agitation. There's every chance that we'll see some more victories again if these campaigns continue, which demonstrates that, you know, people power is possible. And these are those contacts. So thank you very much. Look forward to the questions.
Thanks very much, Richard. It really strikes me how many similarities there are as we go country to country, either in the way the industry campaigns or in the way the projects are pitched. We're now going to move to Tim Judson, and Tim is the Executive Director of NIRS in the US, Nuclear Information Resource Services. And Tim has the ideal position of being the one presenter today whose country is not currently actively pursuing a deep geological repository. But maybe it's not so ideal. Tim, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Bernane, and thanks everybody for being here this afternoon. So yeah, I have the dubious distinction of being, from the U.S. and where we, despite having a policy for nuclear waste repositories, we actually are not working on one at the moment. And so I'm going to sort of give you an overview of what that means, for the situation we face. So to just kind of give a brief rundown of how we ended up in this situation, where I thought about giving a really short presentation, which was just a blank slide to indicate that there is no nuclear waste repository in development in the U.S. and we don't have a plan for one. But the reality is that we do have a policy that sets forth the need for, or the priority on having a nuclear waste repository program. And that starts going back to the whole framework of our nuclear policies in the US, with the Atomic Energy Act, which essentially created the pathway to commercial nuclear power. And the amendments to it, like the Price-Anderson Act, which established basically sort of a liability cap on private industry and the government as a whole for damages from nuclear contamination accidents. you know, but also our environmental framework under the Environmental Protection Act, which set forth environmental standards, or the process for creating environmental standards, but sort of ultimately, sort of culminating in 1982 with the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, which when the commercial nuclear industry started in the U.S., the expectation was that we were going to be reprocessing irradiated fuel, and then and then essentially treating nuclear waste as a commodity to be continually sort of reprocessed and reused. But that quickly became apparent in the 1970s that there was both nuclear weapons proliferation risk to commercial reprocessing, ultimately, a lot based on India's nuclear weapons test using plutonium from reprocessed nuclear power plant fuel, and the basic environmental disasters that have happened at every nuclear reprocessing site, including a commercial facility that was operated for 6 years in the U.S. So in 1982, the government declared that nuclear irradiated fuel is waste, and established that the government would take ownership of it. And that sort of resolved the industry's sort of conflict about this, in that essentially they weren't going to be responsible in the long run for the cost of disposing of nuclear waste. They would have to pay fees on an annual basis to fund the program. But in 1987, the act was amended to essentially cut short the process of investigating repository sites, and it sort of politically designated one site, Yucca Mountain, which is located in the state of Nevada on indigenous lands, as the sole site to be considered for the first repository. And then with a statutory limit on the amount of waste that could be stored there, 70,000 metric tons, 10,000 metric tons for essentially military weapons waste, and then 60,000 tons for commercial nuclear waste. It also committed DOE to start taking possession of the commercial waste by 1998, which turned out to be wildly overly optimistic. And of course, throughout the 90s and into the early 2000s, much of our attention in the movement was devoted to fighting the Yucca Mountain site because it was known to be unsuitable. And that eventually proved out to be the case. There was way too much groundwater penetration in the site. It was located in a seismically active area. In fact, the Western Shoshone, whose land it's on, their name for the site is snake moving northward, because they had observed over centuries that, in fact, the mountain was moving due to geologic activity. And there's also evidence of volcanic activity with magma pockets a few miles from the site. So eventually, between the opposition of the state of Nevada and the Western Shoshone and the broader movement, they won a significant court ruling that invalidated the lower environmental standards that had been adopted in order to kind of try to legalize the site. And that resulted in 2010 with the Obama administration essentially defunding the Yucca Mountain project. It effectively halted a license proceeding that, for licensing the repository site. But then there have been subsequent developments that have complicated the matter, including a 2013 court ruling that suspended collection of nuclear waste fund fees from the industry on the basis that the Department of Energy, while halting the Yucca Mountain project, did not have a credible estimate of what the cost of the repository program was going to be. And so effectively for the last going on 11 years, the nuclear industry has not paid nuclear waste fund fees for the eventual disposal of their irradiated fuel, essentially because the Department of Energy is reneging on its responsibility to deal with the waste, and Congress has not amended the Nuclear Waste Policy Act again to choose a different path and to authorize work on other options for repository sites or other ways of long-term management of the waste. what that has resulted in from the perspective of reactor communities where the waste is generated and stored was that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission had to promulgate a new policy under which it would license reactors, and it adopted a policy in 2014 called continued storage, which essentially accepts that the repository program is is essentially in a stalemate, and essentially rationalizes the indefinite accumulation and storage of nuclear waste at reactor sites. Now, what we see is that, basically this, the US is one of the main culprits in what we consider a global nuclear waste crisis. And we don't see that disconnected from the entire rest of the nuclear fuel chain. For every, pound of irradiated fuel that goes, or a pound of fuel that goes into a reactor and then comes out as irradiated fuel, there are thousands of pounds of radioactive waste produced from mining uranium, milling it, enriching it, and processing it into fuel. And this has affected communities across the country and across the world, and imposes a real threat to the health of our environment and the safety of our water supplies around our own country and around the world. So what we see is that we have in the US 15,000 abandoned uranium mine sites. Most of these are located on or near indigenous lands. And the consequence of these mines being abandoned is that essentially radioactivity and contamination from the mines that have been these disturbed uranium deposits is accumulating in the environment. And in some places, the ambient radioactivity in these areas is as high or comparable to the exclusion zone around Chernobyl from uranium mining. But then what we have, around the country as a result of this fuel chain is, over 70, close to 100 sites where high-level radioactive waste, whether it's reprocessed fuel waste from the defense program or civilian use, or the irradiated fuel that's sitting at commercial reactor sites. And so what we see if you go back a slide is that, of course, most of the uranium mining is in the less populated western part of the country. Most of the nuclear waste, the high level waste, is stored, on sites in the eastern part of the country where most of the nuclear power plants are. What that means for states where this waste is now being stored indefinitely is the accumulation of very large amounts of irradiated fuel sitting basically, in vulnerable facilities at reactor sites, and most of them very close to water sources, rivers, lakes, the ocean, where the reactors are located. And what we've had in the US, because of the fact that the reactors in the US were designed to only hold a few years worth of irradiated fuel, because the expectation that it would be sent away for reprocessing, is that the commercial reactors have had to store inventories of fuel that they never anticipated. And so what that meant initially was that the industry got regulatory approval to increase the density of the racks in the fuel pools at reactor sites to essentially maximum density. So originally these reactors were designed with pools that that were loosely racked, that had air circulation, in case the pools developed a leak, and the water drained out, that there would be enough air circulation to cool the fuel. Now we have pools that are packed with about 5 to 6 nuclear reactor cores worth of waste, that are as densely packed as the reactor cores themselves, and in which there is because they have to prevent criticality from happening in the pools. There's no air circulation. There would be no air circulation between the fuel assemblies in those pools, and so they could catch fire. And in fact, that's been well known for over 20 years. And there have been scientific studies, both by independent experts, as well as the National Academy of Sciences and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, that confirm that the danger of a fuel pool fire at a commercial reactor could have massive environmental impacts, even greater than a nuclear reactor meltdown. And these are some maps of some of the modeling of those scenarios for a nuclear power plant in the state of Pennsylvania. Showing essentially the extensive areas that would be contaminated above the habitable radiation limits. We also have so since the pools are now full and can't accommodate any more waste, the industry has been having to move more and more of the inventory they produce into what's called dry cask storage. So now, it's approaching half of the nuclear fuel and radiated fuel inventory at U.S. reactor sites is now in essentially temporary canisters that are stored on concrete pads outdoors, unprotected essentially, except by security guards. And the canisters themselves, like I mentioned, are not designed to be permanent storage canisters. These are designed, they're licensed for 40 years and would need to be relicensed. They consist essentially of mostly thin stainless steel canisters in which the waste is welded shut. And then those are put into concrete, what they call overpacks, to to provide some measure of radiation shielding for the workers nearby. The idea that they've had all along, for at least for over 20 years, is that these canisters should be designed to be transportable so that they could, when it's time to move the waste to a repository or interim storage site, that the canisters could be taken out of the overpacks, put on a truck or train, and then sent to that site. But no one has ever done this. In fact, the industry has been using larger and larger dry casks as a way to reduce costs. And so it's not clear, these canisters are now so heavy with the cask that they're using, it's not clear whether they could be moved on railways or highways in the US. To give a sense of what that would look like, this is a rendering of a map that was produced based on the proposed transportation routes for waste from reactor sites to the Yucca Mountain site. Which would crisscross the country across, 80% of our electoral congressional districts in the U.S. And passing through major cities as well as over rivers, some by barge, posing real risks of accidents en route. So we fought all this. And the consequence was that we effectively have won if the goal is to stop a repository from being sited. But that hasn't stopped the accumulation of waste at reactor sites, basically uninhibited. There have also been proposals for what are called consolidated interim storage sites, or in an earlier, terminology, monitored retrievable storage. There have been at least 5 different proposals for these kind of sites over the years. They've all been stopped, at least so far. Most recently, there were 2 private CIS facilities that were proposed for New Mexico and Texas. The NRC actually issued licenses, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission issued licenses for those sites over the objections of the people in those states as well as the state governments. But fortunately, at least for now, a court ruling has invalidated those licenses on the basis that, under what we considered an accurate interpretation of the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, that the policy in the U.S. is for a permanent repository, and that CIS facilities cannot be sited until a repository is in operation, to guarantee essentially that the CIS sites don't become de facto repository sites or above ground repository sites. There is going to be a ruling by our Supreme Court coming up in a few months that will decide whether that ruling stands, or whether the licenses will be reactivated. It's still not clear how the industry would pay for this to move the waste there. There is a sort of precedent under the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, where since the DOE has been in default since 1998 for accepting ownership of the waste because there is no repository to send it to, that the utilities have been suing the government and receiving essentially compensation for the cost of continuing to store the waste at their sites. And so that is going to continue in perpetuity at this point. But there's some concern that essentially they could work out a way to use those funds to transport the waste to CIS if in fact the court decides that that's legal. But in the interim, since there is no repository program, there's also been proposals from the private. There's been a proposal from the private sector essentially bringing sort of a nuclear startup company into the mix, which is proposing to develop repositories that they say could even be built on site at reactor sites using the same drilling technology that's used for hydraulic fracturing for natural gas to drill into shale foundations. And you see that here on the image on the left, what that would look like. What they're proposing is to go basically a mile underground or more to basically put canisters of waste into shale formations, which no one here in the environmental movement has supported, but that they've gotten some attention for. And then frankly, given the utter stalemate going on at the federal level, it's they've got an audience because the DOE isn't doing anything to move the nuclear waste program forward. What is also happening at the same time is that the DOE in trying to make it look like they're addressing the nuclear waste situation, has developed what they call an integrated waste management system program, in which they are, prioritizing trying to site a CIS facility, even though that's still illegal. But they've also initiated what they're calling, consent-based siting, which is to develop a policy by which nuclear waste sites would be chosen by, with some sort of consent-based process with the community. But I think everyone understands, at least from our side, that basically they are trying to create a process, whereby they would basically bribe communities to accept the waste, whether it's in a CIS or in a repository program. I think we do expect, based on what the court rules in the CIS case involving these licenses, that there could well be legislation introduced in Congress this year to try to break this stalemate. It will likely prioritize CIS as a sort of a fix in the near term that would address the industry's needs without protecting the environment. But also, under the new Trump administration's policy program, which they seem to be implementing, called Project 2025, on nuclear waste policy, that program favors reactivating the Yucca Mountain project and essentially pushing it through over the objections of the Nevadans and the Western Shoshone. That this has been proposed a number of times over the last 10 years. It's never managed to pass Congress, but given the environment here in the U.S., I think we're preparing for such a proposal to come forward. So with that, I'll wrap up.
Great, thanks very much, Tim. Excellent presentation and sobering situation. I'm going to ask all of the panelists to turn on their microphones at this point, and we're going to move to the question and answer period. So please use the Q&A box in the Zoom system, and I'm going to ask you to limit your questions to questions, not comments, and try and stick to one question, short and to the point. If you have more than one question, enter each question separately. And I think it's set so you can use the upvote. So questions that you are most eager to have presented will float to the top. So we'll go to Q&A now. And I see we've got a couple in the queue. First question is from Susan, and it's to Tim. Tim, you said high-level waste was designated waste after decision was made to not pursue reprocessing. What is the situation now with reprocessing policy and practice in the U.S.?
So there is no reprocessing of commercial radiated fuel happening in the U.S. There isn't a facility to do it. It's actually legal. President Carter in the late 70s issued an executive order essentially banning commercial reprocessing, but President Reagan a few years later lifted that. So it's still legal in the U.S. to reprocess, and the NRC has been creating a licensing process for commercial reprocessing plants. I think the reality of it is that reprocessing is expensive, as well as dirty and dangerous and terrible. But the nuclear industry in the US isn't really interested in reprocessing because it's cheaper for them to get their fuel from essentially mined uranium. And so there's no great push for reprocessing coming from the industry here.
Great, thanks, Tim. We have a question that was posed and then answered, and I'm going to repose it. There was a question for any and all presenters, if anyone can speak to the site selection process and why it almost always selects sites on Indigenous lands. And Richard did answer that, just pointing to the function of nuclear colonialism and racism. Then Kanisha rephrased the question, understanding that, but wondering what reason industry government decision makers rely on in the site selection process. I don't know if anyone would like to comment on that. I could comment from a Canadian perspective, but I'd invite our panelists. Hearing none, I'm going to say that, you know, in the Canadian situation, practically speaking, all lands are Indigenous lands. So the NWMO did a site selection process where they went directly to municipalities, irregardless of the status of the lands. They had municipalities identify their interest in economically benefiting from the NWMO's $16 to $24 billion national infrastructure project. They established relationships with those communities, and then they did their site identification based on those municipalities' interest in being part of the process, not on any other criteria. And because most of those communities were in Northern Ontario, all of Northern Ontario, and in fact, the other sites in all 22 sites identified were all very much on Indigenous lands, all part of treaty areas, all with active First Nations in close proximity and further proximity to the lands. So in Canada, in the sites, the communities that they persuaded to express interest, it is invariably going to be on Indigenous lands because those are on Indigenous lands. Tim, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, you know, nuclear colonialism is, you know, and environmental racism is, you know, why we end up with almost all of these proposals, you know, being targeting Indigenous lands. I think if you take a sort of a, you know, a deeper view at it, it's also that, you know, no one wants to have a nuclear waste repository or nuclear waste storage, you know, in their community. And so the whole process has gravitated towards essentially the politically most expedient path. And so, you know, what that means is that, you know, who has the power to stop it from happening. And so, you know, Indigenous communities in the US are among the poorest and, you know, and most politically marginalized. They all, you know, also they've, you know, a lot of Indigenous peoples live in places that are remote from major population centers. And so it, you know, it checks all those boxes from the DOE's standpoint, you know, to choose those places. But I'll also say that, you know, we ended up with Yucca Mountain in the US for not only that reason. You know, first it was that Yucca Mountain was also on the Nevada nuclear test site, where 800 nuclear weapons have been detonated in, you know, in the years before. And so, you know, it was land that the DOE had already, the Western Shoshone Nation is the most bombed nation on earth. And so the DOE just continued what they were already doing. And then secondly, because in the 1980s, when, you know, when the Nuclear Waste Policy Amendments Act was passed, Nevada was also a very low populated state and only had one congressional representative. And so, you know, Nevada was also the state that was least politically powerful to stop it. And so there were other states like Texas that were also considered, but those states objected, and Nevada ended up, you know, being the one that was selected. So I think it's ultimately about power, and, you know, and because of colonialism, you know, Indigenous communities in the U.S. are extremely disempowered in the political system.
Great, thanks, Tim. Johan, can you add to this?
Yes, I just wanted to say that in many cases, the alternative for siting is often that you site it in a community that has nuclear power, that has an experienced nuclear power. This has been the case in Sweden. I said very shortly that it was quite a complicated process to find a site in Sweden for the industry. And in the end, they just ended up right close to 2 nuclear power stations. And then they chose one site right next to one of those in the Forsmark. And the main thing there for them, I think, was that the only way they could find any sort of acceptability would be to go into nuclear communities. So that's also what you can see somehow also around the world that has also been happening.
Thanks, Johan. I'll just add, I think the other question in Canada is not only why would they select sites in Indigenous territory, but why did they persist? In the case of the Revel site in Northwestern Ontario, Treaty 3 chiefs in Assembly in October voted unanimously to express their opposition. Anishinaabe Nation has done the same. Anishinaabe Nation and Iroquois Alliance has done the same, which means the entire route from the reactors in Ontario to the site are in territories where the chiefs and council have expressed strong and clear opposition. So the question is, why do they persist? That, you know, Canada has a commitment on paper, at least, to free, prior, informed consent, not proceeding without, and yet they persist. Tim, you wanted to add something, and then we'll go to our next question.
Yeah, I think it does vary by country. You know, in the U.S., like I showed on those maps, you know, most of the nuclear power plants in the U.S. are in the eastern, you know, more highly populated part of the country, and most of the uranium mining and nuclear waste proposals are in the western, less populated part of the country. And so most of the places that have been targeted for nuclear waste storage, high-level waste storage in the U.S., are states that don't have any nuclear power plants at all. And so I think it really is. I think it depends on sort of the dynamics in the country. In the U.S., I think it's that the states that have nuclear power plants are more highly populated and sometimes wealthier, and have more political power. And so it has shifted the targeting of locations for nuclear waste sites to states that are lower populated and less politically powerful.
Thanks. We have 3 more questions in the queue. The next question is from Mary. And Mary asks, what are the chances that the current administration in the US will see it appropriate to ship nuclear waste to the proposed deep geological repository in Northern Ontario? Does Canada have robust legislation to prevent this? I don't know if you want to comment on that, Tim, and then I'll add something to that.
So can you rephrase the question, Bernay?
So what are the chances that the current administration in the US will see it as appropriate to ship nuclear waste to the proposed deep geological repository in Northern Ontario?
Well, that's an interesting question. We haven't heard them talk about it at all, except for the absurd notion of annexing Canada as a state of the U.S. But I think that we haven't heard any real proposals from the Trump administration about what they want to do. The current proposal that they do have, in their sort of their policy playbook is to pursue Yucca Mountain, and so that's the only thing that we know is a strong is at least a likelihood that they would advocate is to reactivate the Yucca Mountain project.
And I'll say, in terms of the strength of Canadian legislation, I would say it's not robust. The Nuclear Fuel Waste Act was passed in 2002. And at that time, at committee hearing, both in Senate and Parliament, there were interveners or witnesses who argued that there should be a prohibition against the import of waste included in the act. And all that made it into the act was saying that it would be the deep geological or the eventual repository or facility would be for Canadian waste, but there was no prohibition. We did look at this in 2010, 2011, when the siting process was in its early stages. And we looked at the time, it was the North American Free Trade Agreement. And under that trade agreement, it appeared that there could be a trade challenge because if it was considered to be a good or a service, Canada could not proportionally provide the service to Canadian companies and not to American companies. I don't know that we still have a trade agreement in place with the US at this point. But that is then the counterbalance to that is the convention on radioactive waste says that each country will deal with the waste, manage the waste within its own borders. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty, Mary, about under current and past legislation, but certainly current legislation in the current administration in the US is perhaps harder to predict than previous ones, putting it mildly. Question from Norma to all participants. I'm closest to the Japanese anti-nuclear movement, where it's really hard to get young people's interest. How transgenerational are your movements? It's great to see France where attract young people. Young Indigenous activists are important in the US for sure. If our panelists would like, maybe let's hear from Chuka and Tom first about the movement in France and how young people are engaged, the younger activists are engaged.
I think there are many reasons. One of the main might be that there, as always, we always try to consolidate the struggle by linking it to other struggles, and there has been many events linked to feminist groups, to anti-speciesism groups, and right now, the next day there will be an event 200 people coming here in the House of Resistance, like 150 persons, about animals and welfare and anti-speciesism, and also during the occupations of the geology, occupations were mainly younger thing, like there were a lot of new people, and in 2017 there was still the that of Notre-Dame-des-Landes, which was really active, and there have been a lot of connections between the Notre-Dame-des-Landes VAD, which was a bit an airport project, which was more linked to the Gulf climate movements and growth, and a lot of people moved around from these two struggles. And here and there, there is also there's also a lot of collective houses where people can install themselves, and so and that are open to anyone who wants to come and stay. And so it attracts often younger people who are looking for other way of living their lives. So in the collective settings and in the struggle setting. So these three reasons explain why there's always been a lot of younger people in there, but it's definitely the ending, and we always work closely with a lot of different associations and everything, and the anti-nuclear movement is mostly older, but in there it's kind of specific here that there are a lot of younger people.
I believe we can hear you.
My apologies. Tim, Johan, Richard, if you'd like to add to that, or Chuka, if you had anything more to say. So the question is around how intergenerational is your movement, and how do you attract young people, engage young people? Chuka, did you want to add?
Did you want me to add something, Renee?
Richard, Johan, Tim, Richard, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't have a hang on. Yeah, in terms of the nuclear-free local authorities, the main ways that we try to engage with younger people is we've worked with younger elected members, sorry, councillors. So we've had quite a few councillors who've come to us with various campaigns around not just nuclear waste, nuclear power stations, things like the transportation of nuclear weapons convoys, things like emergency planning issues, Recently, we've had some concerns about the basing of US nuclear weapons at a supposed RAF base called Lakenheath in Suffolk. Because we're anti-nuclear weapons as well, I do a lot of work around peace. So I've got a lot of counsellors engaged around that. The other way I engage with young people is to try to get university students engaged with our work as well. In terms of the actual campaigns on the ground, it's true that the majority of people who engage with those do tend to be people who are retired, particularly with the nuclear waste issue, because a lot of the people engaged with the campaign specifically went to retire in places that were rural and coastal, thinking there'd be quiet places to retire, and then they're suddenly faced with the prospect of an engineering project that's the size of the construction of the Channel Tunnel, that's going to last about 10 years and involve the movement of 10 million cubic square meters of rock at least, and trucks going up and down for a decade. And that kind of galvanizes them into activity, understandably. We do try to engage with young people, though, certainly. One comment I did want to make, though, specifically was on the other side of the coin, which is that the nuclear industry most definitely tries to engage young people. We've seen that through the nuclear waste projects that are going on in the UK. They've even produced booklets specifically for very small children, colouring booklets that they could use, where they present elements of the nuclear waste dump as benign, including radiation. In effect, the radioactive waste is, in effect, a naughty child that we should understand and give time to calm down. And that's kind of the message they're putting across. Radiation isn't all that bad. We just need to tolerate it and work with it really within our communities. The other thing that they've very definitely pushed is going out into schools. And what they've tried to do is package their offer as a STEM project. So trying to engage young people in science, particularly with the idea of getting people into apprenticeships with the nuclear industry. They've tried to package it as a exciting career move for young people to go into the nuclear industry. And particularly one of the things they are trying to do is target young women. That's been one of the very active things that they have done in the UK. Unfortunately, there's quite a lot of young people-led groups that have kind of complied with this and got involved with this, particularly because what the industry is trying to do is promote nuclear as a net zero option. We need nuclear to get a clean energy future, to get a sustainable energy future. And they're trying to package that in a way that makes it attractive to young people who are concerned about the planet. So there's a real issue there, because obviously the nuclear industry has got infinite resources compared to the anti-nuclear movement. So it's a very pertinent question, and it is one of real concern to people involved in this movement in the UK.
Thanks, Richard. Chuka, I think, wants to add something, and then I'll check with Tim and Johan, and then we'll close. Go ahead, Chuka.
Yeah, I can. I wanted to react to what has been said. That also, it's like I told you, the city they already built, like the Andra, but they also have this kind of museum, and it's one of the things that, like, if you're a kid living in Meuse around Bure, which is a very poor, depopulated area, probably one of the few travels they do with your school is to come and visit Andra, so that's kind of depressing. But yeah, actually what I wanted to talk about is, even though Tom talked a little bit about it before, was this link with the feminist movement, which I think brought a lot of people to Bure. After when the occupation of the Guadeloupe ended, there was this big drop of the movement. Like a lot of the energy was taken by all the lawsuits and just getting over this kind of traumatic moment of the struggle, and a lot of people were coming. And then there was this group which is not very active, but it was very important for me, that was called the Bombatonics, so the atomic bombs. And that was a feminist group who I guess they were pretty much inspired by what happened in the UK with the, how they call this little encampments. The names can come back later. The that took place in the UK during the 70s, I guess. And so yeah, this bringing this feminist reflection to this eco-feminist reflection in real, like, brought a lot of global interest and a lot of people back here, and also a lot of actually joy and creativity, which was able to start again the struggle to.
Thanks very much, Shuka. Tim or Johan, did you want to add just before we close?
Yes, I can just add a short. I mean, it's a general problem within the whole environmental movement to engage young people. It's become, I think, more and more difficult with the years. In Sweden, at least, the largest Swedish environmental organization, the Swedish Society for Nature Conservation, they have a youth part connected to it, which allows communication of nuclear issues. But I think also you have to be aware that even though social media can be very negative in many ways, it's also a way to reach out to younger people if done correctly in the communication by good communicators in the environmental movement. So that's one way of reaching out, at least.
Johan, Tim, anything to add?
I mean, just that I think that it's generally a problem with people's where people are focusing their attention, and when a lot of the older generation of folks who got involved in these issues decades ago did that, it was because we were in a period of nuclear expansion, and there were nuclear power plants being built in many places, and people were fighting that because they recognized that it was going to affect them. And I think, in the US at least, we've really not, built nuclear power plants here for a long time. But when there is, a nuclear waste, siting proposal, when there's a nuclear power plant that's targeting, a particular community, I think we do see younger people get involved. But I think writ largely, the attention within the environmental movement is on the climate crisis, and the nuclear industry has done a good job of sort of segmenting nuclear out from being a central focus of that. And so, I think that we have we're competing for attention spans and whatnot. But I do think that it's not that there's necessarily some great omission going on by the anti-nuclear movement that's vastly underfunded and under-resourced. I think we have a generation gap in how people communicate. Younger people are getting a lot of their information through social media channels that, older grassroots activists in the US are not facile with. And so there's a combination of things. It's complicated, but I think that, when it comes down to, having, specific fights over things that are, that are local and affect people, that the younger people do get involved. It's, I think, like I said, it's mostly a competition for attention with multiple environmental crises going on.
Great. Thanks very much, Tim. And thanks so much to all of our panelists. Excellent presentations. And I will share the links that I have on the screen, and also some links that our speakers shared in their presentations, so you can, as participants, can follow up with the information that you received today. So thank you so much, Tim and Johan and Richard and Tom and Jukka. It was really appreciate your time and your expertise that you shared with us today. This is the third session of 4 in the Nuclear Waste Online series for 2025, and our final session will be next Tuesday at 7 p.m. in the evening Eastern time, and that's on big nuclear expansionism in Canada, which is, I will say, rampant. So again, thank you all, and I hope to see many of you again next week.